Hello and welcome back to Psychology 303, the analysis of everyday behavior. This is Dr. Williams, and this lecture will be over Chapter 17, talking about the use of timeout and response costs. So we have lots of little examples here of timeouts. I like the polar bears. I think they're funny. And response costs, of course, the example being getting a ticket. All right, so let's talk a little bit about timeout. Timeout is defined as a brief loss of the ability to earn reinforcers. So it's not the loss of the behaviors that would earn reinforcement. There are two types of timeout. There's exclusionary timeout and there's inclusionary timeout. Exclusionary timeout means that the individual, when they misbehave, are removed from the reinforcement situation. They're removed from the setting. So things like timeout where you have to go to your room or whether you have to sit in the hall, it removes you from the environment where others are earning reinforcement. Inclusionary timeout, on the other hand, you stay in the reinforcement setting, but no reinforcers can be earned. So the individual remain. Well, we talked a little bit previously about timeout ribbons and wristbands. So having a wristband means that you're eligible for reinforcement, but if you're placed into inclusionary timeout, your wristband is removed and you sit in your place, you remain where you are, but you're not allowed to participate and you're not allowed to earn reinforcement. Inclusionary timeout is popular in middle schools and high school because we don't want children missing out on the instruction. So they're able to remain in the environment, in the classroom, hear the instruction, but they no longer are called on to answer questions. They no longer can earn tokens or whatever it is that you do in your classroom. So they're, and they may have to sit in a separate location. Might also be a way of identifying them as not being eligible for reinforcement. It's important to remember that in both cases, whether it's inclusionary or exclusionary, the timeout setting cannot be secretly reinforcing. I have a friend who had two children, and he used timeout with both of his children. And for one of his children, timeout was clearly aversive, and he would cry when he was put in timeout and was clearly unhappy at being removed from the situation. But his older son, when he was put into timeout, sent to his room, not allowed to participate in the game or whatever they were playing at the time. So he was told, okay, timeout, you have to go to your room. And he never came back out. And when they finally went to check on him, he was asleep in his room. And so they let him sleep, and he came out later, and he said, those timeouts are so relaxing. I was able to calm down, and I felt so much better. And so my friend Jesse he would use timeout as a punisher for one child, but he would use exclusionary timeout as a reinforcer for his older son. He would say, if you do a good job on the dishes, you can be in your room for an hour without any disruptions. And so he was able to use the exact same activity as a punisher for one individual and as a reinforcer for the other. So you have to be careful. If you're going to use timeout as punishment, as negative punishment, you need to make sure that it's not secretly reinforcing for that individual. Otherwise, they'll continue misbehaving in order to earn those timeouts. A good rule when you're dealing with children is to give 1 minute of timeout for every year old that you are. For every year you are old, yes. Okay, so for every year. So if you're 5 years old, you would get 5 minutes. If you're 4 years old, you would get 4 minutes. If you're 7 years old, you get 7 minutes. I don't want to talk about how many minutes I would get. I would be in timeout until the next day. So this only works for children. So let's talk a little bit about considerations that you need to think about when you decide to use timeout. There's several. I'm just going to list them here. Sorry about that. And then we'll review them in detail. So One of the things we have to ask is about what is the function of the problem behavior. So this is sort of the functional assessment question that says, what is the problem behavior getting the other individual, getting the person? What do they get when they misbehave? A second one is timeout practical? Will you be able to do it wherever the behavior is occurring? Is timeout safe? Is the timeout period brief? We'll talk a little bit about the length of timeout. Is there a risk of escape? Can escape from timeout be prevented? Also, can interactions be avoided during timeout? We're going to talk about the role of conversation and the role of language in timeout. And then finally, is timeout acceptable in the given situation by the people who are important to that particular situation? So let's talk about each of these in detail. So what is the function of the problem behavior? So this is basically a simple FBA question, and you may decide that you actually need to conduct an FBA to get all of the information. What exactly is the problem behavior producing? Is the time in period where they're earning reinforcement, is it sufficiently reinforcing? If the individual does not enjoy the activity that's going on, misbehavior could be related to escape. Crucial that the time in location activity situation is reinforcing for that person, and the time out would therefore be aversive. That's really important. So is your timeout a reinforcer for your child? Is this escape behavior? Are they getting to take a break? Are they getting quiet time away from the activity? If so, then find another way for them to earn that quiet time in an appropriate way. Make an effort to reinforce appropriate alternative behaviors. Plan your intervention to include reinforcement for appropriate behaviors. So ultimately, what is maintaining the problem behavior? Is it escape? Is it avoidance? Is it attention? And then try other forms of intervention like extinction and differential reinforcement if you think that your timeout is not going to be effective. Is timeout practical? So let's say that you decide that timeout is going to work, and that the function of the misbehavior is not simply to escape. And so now we have to ask, is the use of timeout actually practical? Is this a good place and a good time to use timeout? So you need to know that it will work for you as the intervention specialist. So timeout is hard to use when you're out in the community. So if I were taking some of the guys from the Trellis Center to Super One, and I've got 4 or 5 of them and I'm watching them all together, it's very hard for me to put one individual in timeout in Super One when I'm in charge of more than one individual. So it may not be practical. Also, look for things that you should look out for that could make things less practical. So, for example, does putting them in timeout create resistance or confrontation? Like Harry, timeout from restraints, he goes into a full-blown tantrum. You can do that in a laboratory room or in a treatment room. A little hard to do when you're out in public. If you're in a classroom setting, is putting the individual in timeout and their reaction to it going to be so severe that it's going to disrupt everything else that's going on with the class? So you should consider the use of inclusionary timeout or the use of timeout ribbons or wristbands. You can also ask, is there an appropriate place to hold an exclusionary timeout? So if you insist that it be exclusionary and you want to remove that individual from the setting, is there an appropriate place to do that? Remember to keep it short and then to reinforce appropriate behavior immediately. So you have to not let your emotions get in the way. When the individual comes back from timeout, and integrates back into the group, you need to not hold a grudge, as they say. You need to be emotionally distant from that situation and be ready and willing to provide reinforcement for appropriate behavior immediately. is timeout safe? Wherever you decide to hold timeout, the location, the area itself must be safe. You have to make sure that there are no dangerous objects where the individual can hurt themselves. We don't want them to cause harm to themselves in retaliation for being put in timeout. In many cases, you can't leave the area unattended. So the old days of sending a student out into the hall are pretty much over, because children, unsupervised children in the hall at school can get into a lot of trouble. They can do property damage, they can hurt themselves, they can disrupt other classes. I mean, there's a lot of things. You can't just send them out unsupervised into the hall. You have to be able to see them, or you have to have other adults that can watch them to make sure that they're not getting into any more trouble or doing anything dangerous. Certain that the individual is not ignored or forgotten. They have to be supervised. Remember that if you have a class of 7th graders and you send one of them for misbehavior, you send one of them out into the hall. You have to be careful if they're in exclusionary timeout that you don't forget that they're out there. Remember that you have to keep your timeouts relatively brief. So 7 years old, 7 minutes of timeout, and if you forget them and leave them out there for 20 minutes or 30 minutes, they could get into a lot of trouble, and it's excessive. That at that point they're missing out on instruction in the classroom or not participating in the activities, and so it's not ethical to leave kids for long periods of time in timeout. So you have to make sure that you as an intervention specialist or as a special ed teacher or as a behavior therapist are not at risk of forgetting them because you've put them in a place where you can't supervise them. So you have to be careful about that. Is the timeout period brief? So this ties right in with this next slide. Timeout is defined as the brief loss of access to reinforcement. Being immediately removed from the opportunity to earn reinforcers, it has to be followed by a timely return to the time-in setting. We have to get them back. Timeouts usually range from about 1 to 10 minutes, but they can even be as short as 10 to 60 seconds in some cases. We usually have a contingency that the problem behavior has to have ceased. So let's say you have a child who is throwing a tantrum and you want to put them in timeout and they're 6 years old. All right, so you take them and you put them in their room and you tell them, you can come out after you calm down 6 minutes. And then you have to listen for when the tantrum stops. And that's when you start your 6 minutes. You say, you get 6 minutes of quiet time, and then we'll start over. So it's not just that they're out of the environment, but if the behavior continues, you really need time during which the behavior is not ongoing. In a timeout setting where you put a child in a location where you can't see them, that makes it not very feasible. It's hard to determine whether they're still engaging in the behavior or not. You may need a commitment statement from them as well. Are you done? Are you done with your fit? Are you done with your tantrum? Yes. Are you going to come back and behave appropriately? Yes. And then they're allowed to come back after the 6 minutes. Sometimes children will engage in behaviors in bursts or bouts. Tantruming is a good example. They'll throw a tantrum and then you put them in the timeout room and they might calm down for a couple minutes, but then the tantrum comes back. And so you can always extend a timeout period. So if you go in to get your child from out of timeout, and when you go to get them, they lash out and kick at you, you can say, okay, another timeout. And it's called a contingent delay. So we lengthen the period of time for the timeout as a result of an additional instance of that behavior, and they can come one right after the other. So we saw that with Harry, that they would take his restraints out and he would be angry, and when they would come back in, he would try to grab them, and then he would start to self-abuse, and they would leave immediately for another 5 minutes. And so they were using contingent delays as part of their timeout treatment. Can escape from timeout be prevented? So sometimes when you have, I think about this in the classroom, when you send a student out to sit in the hall, because they're unsupervised, they might do one of two things. One thing that some kids will try to do is come back into the classroom. They'll get bored out there, or they'll be mad that they're not being included, and so they try to come back in. Or they'll actually try to leave. You can put them in a timeout, say, at one end of the room, and they will actually try to leave the room. And so to be effective, the client must not leave the timeout until the interval is up. So we use something called gentle physical guidance, or guided compliance. And for example, you might put your hand on their shoulder and encourage them to stay seated. Restate the timeout rule. Say, because you poked Margaret with your pencil, you have a 5-minute timeout, and so I need you to stay here. And as soon as it's over, you can go back and start working again. If you're working with a small child, holding the door shut to create extinction of the attempts to leave is acceptable, but you can never just lock the door and walk away. I remember one of the first times I put my son in timeout, he immediately opened the door like, I'm not doing this. So I gently put him back in, and I said, you have 5 minutes. And I pulled the door shut, and then I held the door shut. And he fought so hard. But for a minute or two, he really fought hard. And then he kicked the door really hard, and then he went and sat down. So the deal is to avoid any ongoing struggle, because the struggle itself may be reinforcing. Avoid any excessive conversation. Just restate the timeout rule and encourage them to stay in the timeout space. If you can't prevent escape in a legal or reasonable or humane way, then you really can't use timeout. You have to try something else. So we have to be careful not to insist so much that our behavior becomes unethical. Okay, is timeout acceptable in the given situation? For any intervention specialist, whether you're a therapist or a special ed teacher or a paraprofessional or a parent, anyone who's going to be doing behavioral interventions, you have to ask whether the setting in which you are conducting this modification is appropriate for the kind of interventions that you want to use. So we have to ask, is timeout acceptable at this school, in this particular institution? When you're working at any facility, you have to know whether or not your boss agrees with the interventions that you plan to use. Do you have permission from the administrators to use particular kinds of interventions? Timeout rooms right now are a matter of debate. They're regaining popularity. They were very popular in the 1960s and the early 70s, and then sort of went away as in part because they were being used inappropriately. They were locking kids in them. But in recent years, in the last 10 years, some schools have allowed timeout rooms for special education students to be reinstated, and they typically don't have a lock on the door. They don't even often have a latching mechanism, and often the individuals put themselves in timeout. They know they're misbehaving, and so they go into the timeout room on their own, and then they come out after they've calmed down. But you need to know, before you can use a facility like that, you need to know whether the use of timeout is acceptable to the client that you're working with, to their parents, to the teaching staff, to the administrative staff. And then if you are a behavior analyst who comes into the schools and sets up a system where you're using timeout, you have to ask, will the parents or the teachers or the staff actually implement the timeout rule appropriately after you're no longer present? If they disagree with it, if they have doubts, if they are unenthusiastic or even rebellious, then you may have to shift to some other kind of intervention, because if they won't institute timeout appropriately, then it wouldn't be ethical to ask them to do so. So let's talk about response costs. With timeout, you are removing the individual from the opportunity to earn reinforcers. With response costs, you are removing the actual tangible reinforcer from the individual. So you don't move the individual at all. You simply take the reinforcer away from them, contingent on misbehavior. So there has to be that contingency. So they misbehave and they lose something. Response costs are used widely, especially in modern society. They're used by governments, they're used by law enforcement, they're used by libraries and universities, they're used by the IRS. A wide range of institutions utilize fines and penalties, loss of privileges. So there are a lot of reinforcers that could be removed depending on where we are in the world and what we're doing, and so they tend to be specific to the institution, and they're often tied to the specific behavior. Okay, so the considerations for response costs that you need to think about are: what reinforcer will be removed? What are you going to take away? What valued item will you take away when the misbehavior occurs? And is the loss of the reinforcer immediate, or are you going to have to delay it? That's also going to be important. Remember, delayed consequences tend to lose their power. Is the response cost ethical? Is it ethical for you to take that particular item away from them? And is the response cost practical, and is it acceptable to the people who will have to be instituting it after you leave as an intervention specialist? So which reinforcer will be removed? You know, if you're going to use response cost, you have to identify what the reinforcer will be and the amount of the reinforcer and what it will be that's going to be removed. So, and you really should do this in advance. I mean, in some ways you've done that with your bags, because you have a whole bunch of positive reinforcers in that bag that you have to forego when you failed to meet your behavioral goals. So you are not only getting a punisher, but you're also experiencing some degree of a response cost. As the intervention specialist, you have to have control over that reinforcer. You can't say that you're going to take something away when you physically can't do it. I mean, I could take money away from your bank account, but I don't have access to your bank account, so I can't really do that. The quantity of what you remove, or the value of what you remove, has to be large enough that having it taken away is actually aversive. You should see some emotionality when you remove that reinforcer. You should see emotional responses. There should be protests. They should be unhappy. Otherwise, if they don't care about it, then it's not really a reinforcer that you're removing. You need to decide whether the loss is going to be permanent or temporary. So if a child misbehaves with their BB gun by pointing it at a playmate, then they lose their BB gun. Do they lose it for a day, or do they lose it forever? You need to know that before you institute your response cost. You can also employ an earn it back rule. You have to ask yourself, do I want them to be able to earn it back by engaging in appropriate behavior? If there is a minimal required loss or delay, then you can say, well, it has to be gone for 10 minutes. But after that, you can earn it back by engaging in certain responses. So when my daughter was very small, she had a favorite doll. I don't, you guys probably are, well, some of you are her age, so she had a Jessie doll from Toy Story, the one with the little long red braids and the little cowboy hat. And she adored her Jessie doll. Jessie went everywhere with her and participated in every activity. When Dylan was in preschool, she had Jessie with her everywhere. And one of the response costs that we would institute if she misbehaved was that she would lose Jessie. We called it putting Jessie in timeout. We didn't put Dylan in timeout very much, but we would institute this response cost, which was, all right, well, you know, Jessie's going to just have to go in timeout for a while. And sometimes she would be gone for a whole day. And if it was a really egregious behavior, then Jessie would go into the linen closet for a day. But we would institute an earn it back rule, which is, but you can get her out earlier and then we would give her contingencies. So if you can play with your brother nicely for the next, for 20 minutes, or if you can clean up the mess you just made, or whatever it would be. And so you can have earn it back rules, but it shouldn't be something where they get it back immediately. This is where I would use things like restitutional overcorrection or positive practice, so that they are participating in another form of punishment, but practicing the appropriate behavior in order to earn that reinforcer back. And Jessie is still living at my house, and I'm not sure, but I think Jessie actually went to college. I think she may be hidden in the boxes and things in college. I'm not sure. Or she might be tucked gently into a drawer in my daughter's room. But she's definitely still part of our family. Okay. Is the reinforcer loss immediate or is it delayed? Like any consequences, reinforcing consequences or punishing consequences, any delay will reduce efficacy. It will reduce the efficacy of timeout. It will reduce the efficacy of response costs. You can use language if you're working with typically functioning adults, couples, high school kids, whatever. You can use language to bridge that delay if that's possible. This works best with high-functioning individuals. It works less well with very small children, people with dementia, people with developmental disabilities, animals. Language doesn't work as well. I think it's also important to use written reminders. So teachers who cannot deliver punishers immediately sometimes will write the name on the board of children who have misbehaved and who have a consequence, have a response cost or timeout consequence. So if they lose participation with a particular group at recess, their name goes up on the board that says no recess, or that they can't participate in the kickball game, or that you're going to call their parents, so that you can bridge those delays by using written reminders with some children. With intellectually challenged individuals, it's usually best for the response cost to be immediate. Using response cost as part of a token economy, where they can lose tokens, that's also a possibility. You want to keep the concept of earning and losing reinforcers as part of your normal routine. And that way, it functions and it doesn't stand out as more severe than it really is. So if you use this response cost method frequently, then even individuals with disabilities will learn it, because they're going to lose. They won't actually lose the reinforcers, but they can lose the tokens that they use to earn reinforcers. Is the use of response cost ethical? Is it ethical to remove any reinforcer? Well, the answer is no. Some reinforcers can be removed, others cannot. Legally, you're not allowed to violate people's basic rights. So normal and routine care cannot be removed. So you can't take away all meals. So you can't, across the course of the day, you cannot withhold food. They might miss out on a special meal and have to go back to a basic meal. You can lose dessert, you could lose, a special drink, or getting to sit with a certain group of people. But you can't take away someone's meals for the entire day. You can't take away someone's bedding or their clothing or their medicine. You can't prevent them from having water to drink. You cannot put them out in the cold or remove heat, take away their heaters. I've heard of landlords punishing renters by turning off the heat. And that's unethical and I do believe illegal. You can't withhold health care. There are certain kinds of personal items that you can't take away people's glasses. You can't take away people's dentures. You can't take away someone's cane if they can't walk without it. And whatever you do take away cannot stigmatize the individual. All timeout and response cost procedures should be reviewed by someone other than merely the intervention specialist. It should be reviewed by a human subjects committee if you're talking about things going on in an experiment on campus. You may want to review it with CPS, Child Protective Services, with school administrators, review it with parents, and gain informed consent. If you plan to use, if you're planning to use certain response costs, then like access to activities. If you're going to take away someone's access to watching TV at an institution, you probably should get informed consent from their parents or their guardians. Get consent from teachers and staff if you're going to remove things like, if you're going to remove opportunities to engage in certain activities. So if they're not going to be able to play on a sports team, or if they're not going to be able to participate in recess, there's a certain amount of approvals that you need to get and informed consent that you need to get before you can start using certain kinds of response costs. Okay, this is my last slide. So is the response cost practical and acceptable? So you have to ask yourself whether you as an intervention specialist can actually carry out this plan yourself. Can you actually do this? Do you have access to the reinforcers? Do you have permission to use them? And if you plan to use response costs as an intervention that is supposed to stay in place after you leave, will the parents, if you're doing it at home, or teachers, or staff at school, or people in the institution, the care staff in the institution, will they be able to maintain these response cost rules after you leave? If the answer to these questions is no, not really, then you probably need to try a different intervention. There are lots of things that we can do. Timeout and response costs are forms of negative reinforcement, are options for certain kinds of behaviors. But there are circumstances under which either you can't gain control over the reinforcers, or you will be expecting to leave this treatment program behind when you leave, and if you can't get buy-in from teachers or staff or parents, then those particular components may not work. You may need to try something else. All right, so we'll come back and finish up with chapter 18, and that'll give you time to get ready for the test. All right, have a good day.